Councillor Meehan, can you hear us online? Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ke tēnei hui, ke te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee of the 11th of August. So, largely for those in the gallery, welcome. We are recording our meeting and it's available on our YouTube channel, both being live streamed now and at a later date. We've got Councillor Meehan attending online, so we'll just take a moment when we are voting to capture that. Just in terms of our health and safety procedures, if there's an emergency, we'll follow our committee administrators out and evacuate to Te Marae Ohine. There's a defibrillator available at the ground floor front of house if needed, and if you need anything, please sing out. We've got apologies from the Mayor for early departure on council business and also late arrival on council business. Councillor Finlay and Councillor Petrinas. Are there any other apologies? Oh, actually, my apologies. The speaking queue is not currently running while our computer has just decided to take a moment to load this morning. So if you need to speak, if you could just signal to me. At this stage, we believe voting is still okay. All right, so I'll move that the apologies be received, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I'll invite you to vote. Great, that has carried 100%. I've had no notification of any additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? I've got no scheduled public comment. Now, we do have a number of submissions for the Summerhay Streets hearing. So moving on to item 5, we just have a change in that submission number 10 is now unable to speak, and so is circulating some comments via email, additional comments to support the submission. So our first submission is from Jim Owen, submission number 28, and this is on page 38. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
So we've got our traffic light system over here where you've got 10 minutes to speak, And that includes time for questions. So if you'd like to allow space for questions, that'll need to be worked into your 10 minutes. We'll have 7 minutes on green, 2 minutes on orange, 1 minute on red. Oh, my apologies. We actually just need to pass these resolutions to hear the submissions. You're welcome to stay there. So I'll move those, seconded by Councillor Hancock, that the Planning and Strategy Committee hear submissions from presenters who indicated their wish to be heard in support of their submission, and that the committee note the procedure for hearing of submissions as described in the procedure sheet. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. Sorry about that, Jim. You can begin when you're ready.
Good morning and good morning, councillors. Thank you very much for allowing me to submit. My submission is that the former Terrace End Bowling Club is a relatively large block of land in the centre of the city, and it has easy access to all the facilities at hand. Economic good sense tells us that cities expanding into the countryside is expensive for councils, while necessitating increased travel for families living in those areas. It is equally well known that a considerable amount of housing in the inner city is not entirely satisfactory for the present residents, with many older people living in houses which are now too large for their needs. In many cases, the answer to this has been the growth of retirement villages and organisations such as Abbeyfield and your Papioia development. The very rapid rise in house prices has been reflected strongly in the costs of retirement village accommodation, with 1 and 2 bedroom units now priced yes, they're a worry to people selling their houses, particularly in some of our areas where a lot of these older houses and these people are living. So the accommodation with a housing development such as I suggest would lend itself to additional facilities such as possibly a small social area or outside meeting area to enhance the chances of communal cohesion. My submission is that, in light of the above, my submission is that Council facilitate the development of the former Terrace End Bowling Club as a medium high-density housing to fill the market gap I believe exists between the retirement village development, which is well up there, and the Abbeyfield Papio area end of the market. There's a gap in the middle there somewhere. I previously submitted on the Huia Street development along these lines, and there was comment made on the ownership structure that would be best for such a development. Aimed at the part of the market I suggest, likely residents will be able to purchase. However, as has been said before, no matter what colour the cat is, black or white, as long as it catches mice. I would like to move to convert I seek the following decision to move to convert the former Terrace End Bowling Club grounds from being designated recreational to being residential and facilitate moves in that direction. I'm not proposing old people's housing, but housing at a price between two extremes, suitable to be purchased by those who often wish to purchase in that area. Madam Chair, yesterday you spoke to a meeting I attended. There were around 100 people at it, and 2/3 of those people live in houses in the city by themselves. Now, they are houses that are available for young families, especially as doer-uppers and of that sort of thing. If you can find somewhere for those people to go to. Now, I can tell you, because strange enough, I'm in that age group, a lot of those people are nervous about the Julia Wallaces of this world, and they are looking for something perhaps a little bit between those two market shares. I think both your Huia Street development and this former Terrace End Bowling Club fits into that category well and could be made to fit into it. Climate change means cities change and we must increase our density. The people I'm talking about probably won't qualify for your Papioea or Abbeyfield type development. And they're nervous about going into the retirement village concept. Think about that group. I'm not talking about Los Angeles with our great spreading cities, nor even in Auckland in our New Zealand system. I'm really talking about making Palmerston North a little bit more like the old world type cities where it was much closer together. I'm not wanting to get rid of all the green spaces or anything like that, but I do suggest that these two former bowling clubs fit in well to a concept where people in my age group, or perhaps a little younger even, would want to be able to move into and have a community of interest. They wouldn't want all old people in their accommodation, but you could make it more easy for those sort of people to get into that accommodation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. A question from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Jim, for your submission. And I think we all enjoyed the cat analogy. I just wanted to ask you a question about what your understanding or how you would describe medium to high density housing, because you've said that you want council to facilitate that, and I'd be interested to hear from you what your understanding of medium or high density housing is.
The Huia Street one we talked about, the council itself talks about up to 90 people in the area of 3 bowling greens, and I would think that would be tops. Somewhere between, I'm not talking about 6 500 square sections or anything like that. I'm talking a higher density than that. I'm probably talking 3 or even 4 stories.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Jim, and good to hear from you again.
Yes.
I guess following through some of your rationale around particularly the age demographic and the opportunities there, if we were to go into a development approach here for housing, would it be your view that we should design that housing with a specific age demographic in mind?
Tricky one, isn't it? I think probably that's the way to go, because these people will need to have access to. We've got to be very careful that we don't try and get them walking up three flights of stairs and things like that. So yes, there has got to be some thought to. We mustn't rule. I don't want to rule anyone else out, but the group that we've got, you do have to market it towards that age, the demographic that I'm talking about.
Right, thank you for that clarification.
I hope that's not, I hope I haven't confused it there. Yes, if a young family with children want to move in, that's fine, but there's going to be probably the bath, the doors may be a little wider, or and there may be lifts and things like that.
That's clear, thank you.
Not everyone wants to do as many exercises in the morning as I do.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hapera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just can't seem to get this thing to work. Thank you, Jim. They are, thinking about how many people that you're anticipating, they are a generation that likes to have a car. What do you think we would do with all of the cars that they would like to have?
Problems, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's why we want these areas, because they're on bus routes and on routes of that nature. I must admit, I'm not certain it's going to happen in my time, but we're going to have less cars, etc., in our society. And many of the groups in those older age do have their car, that's right. Perhaps if you had a group of, a large enough group, the community group that I have some association with in Wellington, they are arranging a hire car set up within their location so that the people can lease and hire a car. So I'm not certain that you have to have, if you're going to have 76 people in there, that you have to have 76 cars. I've got a feeling that a good corporate body will be able to work on that sort of thing, which is certainly the way the Adelaide Road developed. And one of the developments I came in touch with in Melbourne, that's the way they're doing it as well.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. There's no further questions. Thank you.
I've got a red light anyway, so that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Our next submission is submission number 40 from the Manawatu Community Housing Trust. So this is on page 55, and we've got Margaret May to come and speak to us.
Thank you very much, and I think it's very appropriate that I follow Jim, and what I'm going to tease out a little bit more what Jim was talking about. First of all, thank you to the Palmerston North City Council for its commitment to housing. It's really important, it's a big issue, it's a very expensive issue, and it would be an easy one to dodge, but it's very, very necessary. First part of the submission is that we support the change of the rezoning to residential for the Summer Hayes property. The Manawatu Community Housing Trust tends to go under the radar a little bit. We own the property in Rangatiki Street. We provide housing, not just housing, but we provide housing with support needs. And I think that's the group I really want to talk about. There is a group, and I think Jim kind of touched on it a little bit, but there is a group, a growing group in our community who need support as well as housing. For whatever reason in their background, they are unable to be a good tenant, no commercial operator would want them, they need medical assistance, they need physical assistance, they need emotional assistance, and they just need to learn how to be a tenant, let alone be a good tenant. So that's a service we provide. What we have identified over the last 8 to 10 months is a growing number of people over the age of 65 who fall into that group, have nobody else in their lives, they've never owned a house, and they're desperate. They need not just housing, but support, getting them into the right medical support, and all the services that go with it. So I would urge that that's the group in the community that in fact is falling completely under the radar. There is that group that currently own houses, and they do have a pathway of sorts available to them. There's that group that don't have it and have previously been catered to by what was then Housing New Zealand through their supportive accommodation. That's no longer available to them. The housing's available, but they turn out to be bad tenants and they get kicked out. So everyone's entitled to a warm, healthy home. So I would urge that Palmerston North City Council not only look at rezoning, but look at going into a partnership. I can think of at least 3 private trusts in the city that go completely under the radar, that own properties, who would make great partners, and certainly the Manawatu Community Housing Trust would be very interested in looking at partnerships. It's the great work that's being done by Councilman Papio is great, but there is that group that probably your housing people would look at and say, we don't want them as a tenant, but they need housing, but they just need that leg up or that additional support that we provide to people in the younger age group. We find that the intensity with which some of the services of people in that age group need, we are unable to provide adequately. or there are just too many. Our waiting list normally runs at about 60. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Margaret, and for putting that case to us. Just trying to understand if we were to proceed in that direction, are there implications of that would see us not only being a housing provider as a council, but also a social service provider as a council, or is that brought in through other channels?
It's not. It's a very fine line, because we don't see ourselves as a social service provider. Our role to our tenants is to ensure that the services that are currently in the community are accessed, and if they're not available, our role is to make sure that they become available. Sometimes it means taking a client initially, or a tenant initially, to a service, but just making sure they get the services, to even have a proper diagnostic done, to just make sure that they are accessing the right services to provide some quality of life. No way would I suggest setting up another social service agency, because there are numerous. But when you're out and down, it's really hard to identify what service do I need, either physically or mentally or socially. So it's that in-between link.
All right, thanks for clarification. Madam Chair.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Margaret. Look, I just have a very quick question. Just in terms of your current housing program, you say you've got about 60 people sitting on that waiting list presently. Is it better for you to pepper pot across the community rather than sort of all together? Can you perhaps just give us some comment or context around that?
There are advantages in having them grouped, a group, because it's more economical to provide that linking, that support service that I've been talking about, when you have someone on site rather than go visiting from property to property. And sometimes also their social behaviour is interesting and may not always be tolerated if they're dotted in amongst other residential housing. So having a community, a diverse community in terms of ages and ethnicity and gender is very helpful. So yes, there are definite advantages in having them grouped together, but I'm not recommending that we put 50 units there. It's a moderate number.
Councillor Beattie. Councillors, are there any other questions? No. Thank you for your submission, Margaret. Our next submission is number 39 from Marilyn and Bruce, page 52. And there is also some additional notes that should be on your desk that have been pre-circulated.
Good morning, Madam Chair, councillors, staff, ladies and gentlemen. We are Marilyn and Bruce Bullock. So I'll just hand you over to husband Bruce, who will read our presentation.
The description of this outer public view former Terrace End Bowling Club land, bounded by Summerhay Street, Church Street, Ruahine Street and Ferguson Street, is simply described in the consultation document as 17 Summerhay Street, is an understatement. Legally correct, but belying the site's significance is a strategically located 7,664 metre squared large public green space. To summarise our three-page submission, we mainly support option 3, development for recreational purposes. This option would mean the rezoning of the half of the land currently zoned residential to recreation zone. We would also support option 4, retain for community purposes, although this option is a bit vague. Options 3 and 4 could be combined rather than be split as separate options. Recreation and community purposes could be one and the same thing on this site. Going back to option 1, amendments to the district plan for housing is our least preferred option. As a compromise to those who are determined to see housing built on all of the site, we would reluctantly suggest retaining the current zonings with housing on the half already zoned residential. This would leave the half-zone recreation as an open green space. We would not rule out land banking the site as a holding mechanism. We support the one-page succinct submission of Mr Larry Haste, submission 47, whose views mainly align with our own. We also agree with the content of the Sport Manawatu submission number 41. For many years, our main concern has been the threat to and loss of public green space in Palmerston North. It is a myth that there is plenty of green space in our city. Our green space per head of population is only boosted by the large Ashurst domain area. Second only to Papioi, the area of town bordering both the suburbs of Hokowhitu and Terracend is poorly provided with green space. This old bowling green site is like a hub of a wheel with the surrounding parks to the south Hokowhitu domain, to the southwest Milverton Park, to the northwest Papioi Park, and to the northeast Memorial Park. Travelling to any of these parks from Summerhays Street area by foot or any other method means having to cross a large number of very busy roads, which are getting akin to motorways. Imagine kids, parents with prams, the elderly or infirm, negotiating these routes to get to a local park. You don't want to have to get the car out to drive to a local park. The consultation document states the nearest public open space is 600 metres away, Memorial Park, with Hokowhitu Park and Milverton Park being located within 800 metres of the site. Are these figures as the crow flies? We checked these figures with Google Maps and were given the following walking distance and times, which will make much greater. Walking from 17 Summerhays Street to Memorial Park, 1.5 kilometres, 15 minutes. Hokowhitu Park, 950 metres, 12 minutes. Milverton Park, 900 metres, 12 minutes, or 1.1 kilometres, 15 minutes by another route. Papioi Park, 1.2 kilometres, 16 minutes. In practice, these travel times may be much longer due to the necessity to cross many very busy roads. Travellers' walking speeds, starting and end points may also vary. As many studies have proven, green space is vital in urban areas. Infill housing and housing intensification is being encouraged by the government and developers. The loss of private green space from people's back and front yards needs to be counterbalanced by the provision of easily accessed and locally available parks and reserves. Not all this land needs to be playgrounds, just simple passive green space. Dogs and their walkers also need accessible local areas to exercise themselves and their animals. We note submission 42, which refers to dogs. The only dog exercise area in this vicinity is on part of Milverton Park, where dogs are required to be on a leash. Our vision is to see the former bowling club site retained as a public park, which is its current status. As stated in our submission, we would also like to see the retention of the existing bowling club rooms and their restoration and refurbishment as a public venue. This building has a lovely feel about it, with large windows allowing good views out onto the former greens and plenty of good light flooding into the building. It's a shame to see how this site has been deliberately left to become run down and weed infested. I'll just hand back to Marilyn.
Just adding a further comment, there is a vision that the old bowling club rooms could be used as a community arts centre. Behind me in the public gallery we have Yvonne Marsh and Sister Shirley, who run the arts studio in the Square Edge, looking for more space, and they will be probably sending you some information with their ideas at a later date. They didn't get round to doing a submission, unfortunately. But there's plenty of other uses that it could be used for as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn and Bruce. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Bruce. Just to refer back to your original written submission, you outlined at the end of it a couple different ways forward, and you've reinforced to us here in your spoken comments around your strong preference as a first option. In the written submission, you talk about a second option, which would be less preferable, but would be a hybrid option, basically, where there'd be some housing and some green space retained. You're proposing it a 50-50 there. Does that option still seem viable to you, noting that it's less preferred, but could that be a way forward?
It is certainly an option. Yes, if there's big pressure to house people there. We were just calculating, you might be able to house up to maybe 10, 15 people on that site. It's not a lot. There's a lot of infill subdivisions going on, so it's not like we're desperately short of green space. But if the council, obviously there's the proposal is for housing, but we certainly would see that as a compromise, and you could still have the availability of green space as well as housing. And that would not involve any change to the district plan.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to confirm that was still the case,
Yes.
Madam Chair.
You want to add anything? No.
Thank you, Bruce and Marilyn. There don't appear to be any further questions, so thank you for your submission.
Thank you.
Our next submission is number 42, Beverly, Greenie and Donald, Mcintyre, Campbell. This is on page 62. Welcome, Beverly and Donald. You can start when you're ready. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay. I'll let Don start first.
Hi, I live in 5 Summer Hay Street. I've only lived in Palmerston North for the last 2 years. I'm an artist and a musician and a self-publisher. I recently had a heart attack. I spent time in Palmerston North Hospital. This may not have nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but the fact is, when I was recuperating, I had nowhere to go. So I started going to the bowling club and just sitting there in the sun. It's a beautiful place and it should remain green, all of it. There is a lack of places for us to go and just relax. Sport and all other people are fully catered for here in Palmerston North, but nobody is catered for who just wants to go and convene with nature and find themselves and interact with nature and with our fellow neighbours in a neutral area. And also we have small dogs in our area. There's a lot of small dogs. I meet them when I'm walking my dog around the street. There is nowhere for us to go. Nowhere. If we want to go and have the dog for a run, we have to hop in the car and go down to the river. There is no access to the river up our end of the terrace end. The golf course has made sure of that. We have nowhere to go with our dogs. We wander around, they're on leashes, they're all getting psychosis because they want to meet and play with these dogs on the street. They have because they're on leashes, they feel vulnerable and threatened. Let them off the leashes in this park. We already take our dogs to the third lawn, and they have a wonderful time running around there. And I would also like to submit that, do you realise that car park there floods very heavily? It's almost like a swimming pool. Now, how are you going to fix the infrastructure to put people in there? I would like to know. You can pack people in like sardines forever and ever, but we need a place and a space where we can breathe and live and have art and create rather than just play sports. Thank you very much. That's my submission.
Okay. Kia ora koutou. Ko Bev Green toko ingoa, ko Summer Hay Street aho. That's where I live, in Summer Hay Street. Thank you for listening to my husband. He's very passionate about this place. As you know, what I'm here for, so I'll get right down to it. My suggestion and hope is for a dog park specifically for small dogs. And why? For several reasons. I have a small dog, as Don has said. If I walk my dog, I walk around the block. This walk takes me onto extremely busy roads, which both my dog and I find stressful. To get to the nearest dog park, we will walk for 30 to 50 minutes just to get there, and 30 to 50 minutes to get back. For a small dog and me, that's just too much. So if we want to get to the dog run area, how do we get there? By car, of course. This should not be an option, particularly as I have a fossil fuel older car. Climate change is looming fast, as the IPCC have suggested. Dog parks are set up for large dogs, bicycles and sports people. Linklater Park, way over in Milson, I think it is, which we go to sometimes, is one of these that we've visited. When we go to the river walk, I am constantly looking over my shoulder for cyclists who seem to think that I'm in their way. It's not a fun place to be, and if it's been wet, then walking on the grass is awful. When my dog gets muddy, I get muddy. It's not pleasant. Milverton Street Park and Memorial Parks are for children and sports. Dogs aren't welcome. They may be on leads. I walked there the other day, actually, and I saw no dog signs. And lastly, I pay my dog registration. But what do I get? What I get is not what I would like to have. What I propose is that 17 Summer Hay Street becomes a small dog play area filled with native plants. I know there's lots of roses around the edges, and I know that people love their roses. And I think that those things that people are capable of looking after, they should be kept there. But I also think that we need more native plants in there. We need to encourage native birds, small gardens to bring in pollinators, an oasis for small dogs and their owners to relax, meet locals, away from the circling vehicles on Ruahine, Ferguson, Church and Albert Street. We need an oasis. This will be a community garden for locals to care for. Not everyone in this area has their own garden, and this could encourage those people with gardening skill and knowledge to enjoy this space. There are so few sites that can cater to those of us in the community that don't want to join a group or a team, but we must still be acknowledged. We pay our taxes and our rates. We are stakeholders in this area, and just like everyone else, and we ask for very little in return. I believe that 17 Summer Hay Street would be an ideal area to support those of us who need a mental health space for contemplation while playing with our dogs, who are part of our family. This could be a beautiful space. We must future-proof urban and suburban spaces by not infilling just because we can. Other cities in New Zealand are finding creative ways to utilise unused bowling clubs. For example, in Wellington, the Vogeltown Bowling Club donated the club to the Vogeltown community, who use it for many activities. They haven't bowled down the buildings. They're using those. They rent them out, the kitchens out, so that people can make their jams and their,
A healthy situation.
produce that they can sell in the markets. In Christchurch, the Canterbury Bowling Club is being set up as a hub for young people and an organic veggie farm. So why can't we show how progressive the PNCC is by utilising a site to be a small, beautiful, healthy oasis? As I said in my submission, the Palmerston North City Council caters well for sports activities. Kainga Ora has also begun building social housing and are set to build on a large section of Church Street. Palmerston North has plenty of land to build housing on, but if every piece is taken from local communities, we will end up with worse mental health issues than we already have. I would like the PNCC to show how progressive they can be by keeping this site for the local community and small dog owners to enjoy. As we know, animals support our mental health, so we should be able to support our animal family members with a space for them also. I think that is extremely important. Thank you for your time. Ngā mihi. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for your submission. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Beverly and Donald, for your submission. I just wanted to ask about, and maybe this is more, I guess, for Donald, who spent time there. One of the risks, I suppose, that we've had outlined in maintaining this as a recreation space is that there isn't any it's not visible from the street, that is a sort of a hidden area.
Yeah, but that can be changed.
Do you have a view about, personal safety for people in there where it's not being seen from the street? What's been your feel?
Feel it perfectly safe in there, and if the place is more opened up and more people know about it, I believe that it will. And I believe eventually, if it's done really amazingly well, that people will get rid of their fences around that area, and they'll just go back to hedgerows or whatever, or they'll put a gate in there so they can access that area. I believe that it will be opened up more if people are allowed to go in there and are made aware of the place, which is not happening at the moment. You've got one side that's locked up. It'd be really good when we can walk around the dogs around the park, if we don't feel like going that far, that we can walk through there and come through the other side of Summerhay. Sometimes the traffic's just so heavy that you just want to get off the street straight away. And it is quite heavy on Ruahine Street. As you know, sometimes it's backed up right up to Ferguson Street from the main street, and people are blocking the islands and stuff. It's just, there's no pedestrian crossings anywhere for us to go. So it's ideal for us to have it. And there are a lot of people living in flats already around there who have small dogs. I know this for a fact because I meet them on the streets. A very large number of them.
Can I just say something? I do understand that that issue of safety, being a woman and going into an area like that. But I do think that if you put in housing in there, there's going to still be another issue of safety, except it will be more on the street. Because there's going to be people who are like having more cars. There's going to be people coming past. We live right next to the dairy, so there'll be people going to the dairy all hours of the day and the night, trying to go there. So the issue of safety is one. When I go down to the river, there's an issue of safety as well. Sorry, am I on the red light now? So no matter where you go, there is an issue of safety. But if it is a community and locally supported area, there's going to be, it will be safer than you expect. So it's keeping it in the local community. Anyway, I know we're on the red line, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your submission.
Kia ora.
Our next submission is number 41 from Sport Manawatu. This is on page 56, and we have got Trevor and Brad coming to speak to that.
Kia ora tātou, tēnei ngā mihi kia tatu katoa, ko tatu mai nei tēnei wā. Ai mihi nui kia koutou o te kaunei hira o Papaioia, nō reira ngā mihi nui kia tātou. E kia ana te koro o ngā mātua tūpuna, e kai a te rangatira he kōrero. And so that's a proverb that talks about kōrero is the sustenance of chiefs. So I just want to start by thanking the council for the opportunity to bring people together to listen to this kaupapa today. I'm only the CEO, so Brad's actually going to do the bulk of the heavy lifting here. Kia ora.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to our submission. It's valuable listening in on the other submitters, and it's pleasing to know that people really do care about their city, and particularly about what things are important to them. But the thing I see out of this process is about compromise, and sometimes we've got to make compromises to do what's best for majority, right? Not negating the fact that there are some that may not have had a voice or felt they've had a voice in the process. So our position is really about trying to bring what we feel is important to any future development of that site. I suppose the three key things that we've taken out of this submission process is really about how this council, being bold and aspirational in its thinking, is bringing about innovation, delivering on creative and exciting city, and obviously connected and safe community. So we've heard before from the other submitters, and I'm not really going to reiterate what they've spoken to. I think it's been quite clear I suppose where we've sort of gone is that we acknowledged that recreation zone was more local level or based. It's not a reserve, so nullifying any thoughts that any repurposing of that land goes back into play, rec and sport. That's not necessarily the case. But what we do feel that this council has an opportunity to do is bring about those 3 strategies and create life out of them. And I suppose what we're considering, or what we're wanting the council to do, is consider green space as a potential option to support the development of houses within that area. I think homes. We did hear earlier from, I think Jim mentioned about who this housing is for, and I think that should be the basis of any future discussion forward, is what's going to resonate for those particular, or could be homeowners or tenants, and what that might look like for them. I've included some pictures in our submission just to break up the words. But in a nutshell, I think that's what we're wanting to see, is what consideration is going into supporting those residents to be active. We've heard about having precincts for dogs. I'm fortunate. I live in an area close by where I can walk my dog. I'm conscious that not everyone has that option. But likewise, some individuals, residents within the city, are not mobile, so they don't always have an opportunity to move about. So that's where green spaces, and when I say small, it's fitting in with the local environment. And that could be something about highlighting or the story, the historical story of that site. And if I use my lived experience, I think the term is, my mother lives in a village, and there are some really cool recreational assets there, such as artificial bowling green, there's petanque. Those are really cool options, providing that they're valued by the community that live there. That is a good story piece for that particular site, given the previous occupier. So those are those ideas, and Trevor's happy to answer any tricky questions that you might have. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you for your submission. I've got a couple of questions. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Brad and Trevor. I guess the question that I have is sort of this thinking about this potential sort of hybrid use of this space, where some of it goes to housing, some of it is sort of recreation, perhaps passive recreation type spaces. What I would like to know is there any evidence around sort of how small those green spaces can become before they cease to really be functional? Is there sort of a minimum size that we need to think about?
Yeah, good point. I can't answer that, to be honest, but I think that's something that we would need to consider in terms of what that space would look like. If I use open spaces in general, they're available for the public, but not necessarily all the public use them. So I think we need to be mindful of how inviting that is, and how is that valued? How's that going to be valued? I can't answer that, but I think it's a valid point, and I think it's something that we can, it should be considered and pursued.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Tēnā kōrero. I just have a question about on a page, or second to last page of your submission, where you've said if council decide to repurpose the recreation zone for housing, our desire would be that council ensure revenue gained from the development on recreation and be committed to offsetting costs of sector programmes identified. Do you mean recreational programmes? So, yes. In other words, if council were to sell some recreation land, you think it would be proper that any income went to recreation in the programs in the 10-year plan?
Yeah,
Is that
I
what you meant?
suppose I'll go back to when I opened, just in reference to understanding. We understand that it's recreational zone, not a reserve. So subsequent to that is that the council in its position doesn't necessarily have a legal requirement to invest back into recreation. I suppose there's a goodwill factor, and that value might go back into an asset that is supportive of that site, whatever that looks like going forward.
Okay, so having clarified that, if we were to decide not to sell the land, but perhaps, I don't know, let's assume we do rezone it for housing, and maybe we develop our own housing there, would that change your submission? In other words, how much of your submission is based on potentially revenue from a sale going into recreation programs?
What I would say is that we acknowledge council's in a really tricky situation. We've got a housing shortage, no doubt about it. We understand, and it's potentially anecdotal, that we're rich in green space. But I guess our view is that any type of recreation space, once it's gone, it's gone. You'll never get it back. And so I guess that has to be, we would want this council to consider what the ramifications are for removing what we classify as a valuable land asset.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Madam Chair.
Thank you. There's no further questions. Thank you for your submission. Oh, my apologies. Councillor Hancock has a question, so if you could just sit back down. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Sorry about that. Councillor Hancock?
Brad and Trevor, look, thanks for your submission. I just want perhaps just get some comment from you just around the residential properties that actually back on to Summerhays, the property there. They all face away from that. So I just wonder if you've got some comment around the functionality of, or the potential functionality of that as a green space for those residents.
I guess I'm challenged because I'm not an urban designer. But what I would say is that based on the history of the site, and if I look at the club itself, the 6-foot wall was a mechanism to secure that venue. And of course, the opportunity exists to potentially change what that space looks like. And whilst houses might be facing the opposite direction, I'm sure that there are opportunities to explore how that could change with either, I think the last submitter mentioned about dropping fence heights down or opening it up depending on what the developments would look like. I think part of it is that that there's an entrance in from both sides, but you're not necessarily, it's not wide enough to get 2 cars side by side. And so that's also going to have to be considered around what that's going to look like if you're thinking about the type and purpose of the houses that are going in, homes going in. Are you going to butt them straight up against the fences? If that's the case, then that's probably not going to create any future, and they'd have to walk around.
Yeah, great.
Thank you now. Time's up, unfortunately, but thank you for that final question. Right, our next submission is number 56, Jackie Little, and this is on page 84. Welcome, Jackie. So we've got the traffic light system just over here. You'll have 7 minutes on, just up the front here, 7 minutes on green, 2 minutes on orange and 1 minute on red. It'll beep when your 10 minutes is up. So that time is allocated for your total time. So if you would like to allow for questions, you'll just need to factor that into your time.
Okay, thank you. I'll just read what I've got in front of me. So this is a follow-up to my original submission. What I would like to share with councillors today is the opportunity to look at the potential of the Terraced End Bowling Club site as a space to design a housing development for people with disabilities that could set a higher benchmark for the rest of New Zealand to what is possible. I had written in my original submission about utilising the Abbeyfield housing model, but this could be extended to incorporating what works well from different co-housing models. One idea would be to run a design campaign through the polytechnics to generate solutions. The existing club room building could be retained as a shared common space for residents to attend therapy services. But also in keeping with the Abbeyfield model, this could be used where residents come together to share a meal once a day by an on-site cook housekeeper. One of the common concerns raised in the report from Disability Connect was the anxiety of parents in being reassured that their adult children will have a secure and safe home when they are no longer around. Expecting our most vulnerable residents to reside in existing social housing models where they are expected to be able to negotiate challenging situations that may include confronting behaviours of addictions and/or poor mental health is a dangerous and distressing situation, particularly for someone who may have an intellectual disability. We now have enabling good lives funding for people with disabilities, but this statement can only truly exist if the basic need of safe and secure housing options are enabled first. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jackie. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Jackie, for bringing this option to our attention. Just wanted to ask from the point of view of people with those sort of lived experiences and those sort of needs, sort of the relative suitability of this location relative to possibly other locations in the city. I mean, obviously, this is sort of the location that is on offer in a sense,
Yes.
so it is where it is, but just, is it ideal in terms of location, or is it average?
Well, it's fairly close into the city. It would have bus services. I'm assuming, I don't live on that side of town, but I'm assuming it's close enough for bus services. It's the way it's built, it's quite secure. So it could be, when I was talking about Abbeyfield model, I mean, that could be extended to, I mean, we're talking about retirement villages that have gated communities. And having the building, the existing building to be used for therapies, but also as a sort of a training centre with kitchens for residents to learn to be independent. And if we look at something maybe like Earth Song in Auckland, where it will have fairly small homes, but really have a lot of green space and community garden and etc. built into it. The residents themselves, I'm part of a group that parents that have a social group with young adults with on the autistic spectrum, and a couple of them are driving. So there wouldn't be a lot of use for a high need for parking or anything like that. But I mean, I had a quick look at it, and it seemed like it would actually be a very secure, suitable space. It wouldn't possibly. The ideal people I'm thinking of that would utilise that type of housing, it wouldn't be very high needs. It would be mainly for the young adults who are looking at being more independent, but would really struggle moving in and out of flats, which of course is very difficult in this market to expect a landlord to adjust a building, because really you're going to be down the end of the line.
Thanks, Jackie.
Yeah.
Appreciate those additional comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Jackie. There don't appear to be any other questions.
Thank you.
Oh.
Sorry, Madam Chair. I thought you had I thought I'd made eye contact with you to have a question earlier.
No, sorry, I missed that. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie. I just wondered if you had a view as to whether you would see council, in your scenario where this co-housing was developed, would council retain the land and be a partner with someone like Abbeyfield? Would council have to sell the land to an organisation who would then build something like this and run it themselves? Are you thinking that council would build it and run it? I'm not sure. I understand your idea, but how are you thinking it could work in practice? Because you said you'd had some discussions with Abbeyfield initially.
Yes, I'm not sure if Abbeyfield have ownership of the land or they lease it off council. I'm not sure what their model is when they build. But I mean, really, it's about being open to any possibilities to get something like this off the ground and not be fixed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there isn't necessarily one model, I suppose, is what you're saying? That
Yeah, no, it's really incorporating all the models of co-housing that we see and taking the best of what we see and also putting it out there. Like I said, you know, maybe it could be a campaign through design students and setting the benchmark high, you know, for these individuals of what can be achieved.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That concludes our submissions on 17 Summerhays Street. So we are now looking to item 6. Item 6, and we have got Michael coming to speak to the summary of submissions. Morena Michael and Keegan, welcome.
Morena koutou. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the submitters that presented this morning. I'd also like to acknowledge Keegan for the work that he's done on this engagement exercise and pulling together the proposal. Really, the purpose of this memo is to provide councillors with some consultation feedback on the proposal to repurpose the Summerhays Reserve for housing. Just a bit of a snapshot around the process that's been taken for this. So consultation involved some letter drops. I think it was about 1,200. About 1,200 people received letters around the proposal. There was a digital tour of sorts that was created using Google Street View, so people were able to sort of navigate through that space themselves from home. There was a weekend drop-in session and videos over social media. And there are also 2 newspaper articles that were published through the Manawatu Standard. I think the submitters who presented this morning probably gave a good synopsis of, I guess, the general views that came through the consultation. I'd probably just note that overall the feedback was generally in favour of the proposal. Taking into account there were obviously some different views, and some of those were expressed this morning. So in terms of the process going forward, it's generally laid out in the memo. The process today is really to disseminate information and feedback to you, and that the submissions are here today. Written feedback's already been provided, and that'll inform officer recommendations that will be coming to you in October to make a decision. Happy for any feedback that there might, or questions that there might be.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? Definitely no questions. Councillor Hapara.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the report. There was just one submitter that talked about the closed-off nature of the section and whether or not it could be opened up. And I just wanted to know what your views were around that in terms of the dog park one.
Yeah, appreciate some of the interesting views that people have had, and I think it shows a testament towards their ability to see the site for themselves, which is one of our biggest concerns from an engagement perspective. I probably wouldn't be comfortable with maybe going into details around the format of anything, given, I suppose, at this stage we haven't gotten over the line in terms of what the preferred land use is from council.
I wasn't asking more of an opinion, it was more about the closed-off nature of what it was currently. I wasn't really asking for an opinion on...
Can you reframe the question for me then? Sorry, I must have misinterpreted.
The way it's situated at the moment, possibly around whether or not the fences could come down, really? Or are they our fences or are they neighbours' fences?
I think I'll just jump in. What we'll do is make sure that we've made a note of those concerns. And I mean, they've come through the submissions, and that will be included in the report that officers bring back to us addressing
Thank you.
Points raised.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just having read through the submissions and obviously heard now from a number of submitters, was a little bit surprised, I suppose, that there wasn't more submissions lodged from neighbours and sort of residents in the quite immediate area, and just wanted to understand how comprehensive we were in reaching out to people sort of in that immediate neighbourhood for their feedback.
Sure thing. As Mike had summarised, we did do quite an extensive letter drop, acknowledge that not everyone opens a letter, and within that letter drop we had already preset the date for a drop-in session for people to attend with an actual planner there to address any particular interests. There was signs put up at either driveway, visible from both the vehicle lane and the footpath for people to be aware of it. And when we did host the session, we did have flags up on the Summer Hayes Street side to try and make it very clear that there was something going on. Council vehicle at the front, all of that. And then the usual social media stuff. So whilst I can't quantify the amount of kōrero in this, the submissions process as to who's a neighbour and who's not, I can anecdotally report back that there was quite a large proportion of neighbours at the drop-in session, and quite good quality of conversation that happened. Whether that transferred into submissions, actual submissions, I wasn't taking names, unfortunately. So
that's right. I suppose the point I was wanting to really clarify was, and what I'm taking from that answer, I suppose, is that the local neighbours and residents really had every opportunity in terms of that we could provide to them to be aware of and engage with the process.
I would be confident that we did, yes.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Any other questions? Thank you, Michael and Keegan. There's no further questions. So I will move that the summary of submissions attached to the memorandum titled The Future Use of 17 Summer Hayes Street, summary of submissions presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on 11 August 2021 be received. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote.
Sorry, Madam Chair, there's an extra committee in the...
That'll be fixed by the time the minutes come out. We're just amending that now. We're just voting on what I read out. Great, that has carried 100%. We're actually going to adjourn now for morning tea and get our systems reset. So we will be back in here at 10:25. Right, thank you everybody. Moving on to item 7, confirmation of minutes. I will move that the committee resolve that the minutes of the Planning and Strategy committee meeting of 30 June 2021, Part 1 Public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Our system is back on track. If you'd like to speak, please use your device. Does anybody want to make a comment on the minutes? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. Moving on to item 8, the review of the Waste Management and Minimisation Bylaw, Section 155 determinations. And we've got Julie McDonald and Peter Ridge coming to speak to that.
Kia ora koutou, good morning councillors. We will take this report as read. We're very happy to answer questions, obviously. I just thought I'd make an initial comment to remind you, because this is a bit complicated, how the Waste Management Minimisation Bylaw fits into the other things. I just thought it'd be useful to remind you how the bits go together. So obviously setting within the framework of the 10-year plan being adopted and our new resource recovery plan. The legislation requires that we have a waste management and minimisation plan, the WIMP as it's referred to, that is preceded by the development of a waste assessment, which is currently planned for year 1. So the bylaw is really the last piece of the jigsaw, I suppose, that follows the development of those other direction-setting documents. This determination report, assuming that you agree to make this determination today, that constitutes the review of the bylaw, and then we have, I was going to say at our leisure, that's not quite right, we have time then to review the bylaw, revise the bylaw, I'm not allowed to say review, today's the review, make the determination, then revise the bylaw and the time frame that council sees fit. So waste assessment, WIMP, bylaw follows in that order. So happy to take questions now that I've confused you all completely.
Thank you for that clarification.
I'm a little unwell, I do apologise.
Just before we open it up to everybody, we do have an additional recommendation from Councillor Barrett that I'm just going to have up on the screen now so that we can take questions on the additional recommendation and the officer recommendations. I'll give everybody a moment to read that, but are there any questions so far? I guess I've got a question. I know, Julie, you've already had a chance to look at the resolution. Are you able to just talk about the implications of passing this resolution, resourcing those kind of things, timeframes, because obviously it's just adding in another step?
Sure. So I'll just comment briefly, and I'll probably hand to Peter, who I should have acknowledged, and I apologise, has done the work on this. I guess as it stands, it would be difficult for us to incorporate this separate piece of work within that framework that I've set out. In discussing this proposal this morning, I think staff consider that it would be really worthwhile to do this work. I guess our view would be that it would be more appropriately framed within the WIMP, the development of the WIMP, and so we could see a way that once the determination is made today to make sure we don't have an expired bylaw, that the bylaw could then, the review work on the bylaw, revision of the bylaw, could then pretty much wait while the waste assessment and the WIMP were done so that this work could be incorporated within the WIMP, and then the bylaw, the new bylaw, could be formed out of that work that had happened. There are no real downsides to doing that. We have the opportunity for council to make resolutions to update the administration manual of the bylaw in the interim, should that be required. The alternative would be for us to proceed as this report describes, then do the waste assessment, then do the WIMP, and then potentially have an early bylaw review, which would be a lot of additional work. So that may or may not have been clear. Do you want to add to that?
So, sorry, can I just jump in and clarify? So the intent of the resolution is I guess you're acknowledging there's value in it.
Yes.
However, it's just the detail of it being included in the bylaw that you're suggesting it sits better with the WIMP rather than the bylaw.
So the fourth recommendation from officers would actually allow this work to be done. I mean, this is a very useful steer because clearly the work that's done within the bylaw, you know, is potentially endless. And so this provides some steer as to a particular direction, if you agree to this, that you would like us to take. We don't have the resources, I mean, unless there were additional resources agreed to do this work within the framework that's proposed. But we could incorporate it into the review of the WIMP. Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think just to support what Julie said, it's primarily a question, I think, of timing. So while the draft recommendation up on the screen there says, prior to consulting on the draft waste management and minimisation bylaw, in the report that we've written, we've foreshadowed that work coming back to the council early 2022. But if we were to take the approach that we've outlined, where it's done as part of the WIMP work, then that work would be starting middle of next year. So it would mean effectively putting the revising of the bylaw on hold for another year or so while we did this work as part of the WIMP work, and then drafting a revised bylaw to come forward probably late 23, sorry.
That's right.
Get confused by years. December 23, once that WIMP was in place. And that gets the alignment working really well then, I think, because the WIMP is really the key direction-setting document alongside the resource recovery plan, which has just been adopted. The bylaw is a tool that gives effect to a lot of those things, particularly the regulatory elements. So particularly if, as this resolution here sets out, identifying the way that licensing and regulatory elements can align better with service provision, I think that would be the best order for that.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that's pretty well cleared the questions that I actually had around that. I suppose the further thing that I would ask is whether we've done an assessment at this stage of whether our being involved in the service provision side of things, which is a commercial space, has some crosstalk with what we can or can't do in the regulatory space. Do we know that?
I can talk generally to that. We have Mike Monaghan and Natasha here who may be able to speak more specifically. I think any time you're involved in a service that you provide and also regulate similar services does create some tensions. Within the council, we always ensure that the primary enforcement is separate from the development of those rules. It does create a tension, I think that's fair to say. How much of a tension is harder to say. But I'm aware, for instance, the issues we've had around developing the commercial waste collector licence system is complicated to some extent by the fact that we are a waste collector ourselves. So I think that's why I welcome this proposal. I think it would be a useful opportunity to explore whether there's some alternative approaches that might make that process a little simpler.
Thanks. And further then, just to clarify my understanding, if we were to strike the first part of that recommendation so that it wasn't required to come before the consultation on the draft, when might we see that information come back then?
I actually feel comfortable with the wording as it's phrased because we haven't set a firm date for when that draft would come back, the draft bylaw. We had indicated in the text of the report that it would be early next year, but we haven't made there's no decision that's been taken about that time frame. If we accept that this bylaw drafting process would take place following the development of the WIMP, then I think this resolution would still hold true.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's not a question and probably a correction on page 129. If the committee recommends it today, it will be approved by the council in April 22 or 21. first paragraph on 129.
That's the next report.
Sorry.
All right, no further questions. Thank you, Julie and Peter. Councillor Barrett, are you happy to move the officer recommendations as well? And I'll second those. So we'll move them all in one block, and I'll just open up for any comment. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and certainly happy to move the officer's recommendations and recognise the need quite urgently to make a determination around this bylaw process under Section 155. I would speak now just briefly to the additional recommendations so that colleagues can have a sense of where I'm coming from on this. And it's really, I guess having been here a few years now, and seeing sort of different pieces of the waste management jigsaw sort of come through this chamber, whether it's the regulatory piece through the bylaw or the services provision piece largely through the waste management plan, or whether it's a long-term plan where we're making those budgetary decisions. What I'm interested in is seeing a brief piece of strategic work that gives us an assessment of where the trade-offs are in that, an assessment of where we might actually be able to get better synergy if we make sure that we're thinking about all aspects and the different levers that we can actually push. So it's not asking for anything, I think, beyond just a sense of what is the strategic lens through which we can clearly view all of our regulatory options, our service options, and our budget options. And in my time here, I don't feel like we've really had that opportunities. You know, I guess the question that's come through around timing has been interesting, and it's sort of, to me, a bit of a when do you jump on the carousel sort of thing, because, you know, you get an opportunity when the bylaw comes through, you potentially get an opportunity when the waste minimization plan itself comes through, you potentially get an opportunity when the long-term plan comes through. My view is that, you know, whether or not we want to change anything substantial, this is actually a reasonably good timing for it. We've just signed off a long-term plan, so we've got plenty of time before we need to start putting in the major blocks of the next one. And we're just kicking off a review here of the bylaw, and as we've heard, the waste minimization plan review is sort of within reach. So to me, it seems like a timely point at which to jump on that carousel and actually understand what is the big picture here, and where do we make best use of our regulatory, where do we make best use of our service provision, and as well understanding, as the officers alluded to, really what the tensions are and potentially what the synergies are when we're both involved in the market and regulating the market. So it's a piece of insight that I think would be quite valuable for this council table, and I'd ask you to support it on that basis. We've heard from officers that it can fit within a workflow that doesn't disrupt our overall regulatory or service provision approach. Madam Chair.
Thank you. There is no one else in the queue to speak, so I will invite you to vote.
Sorry, are we taking all of these together, or is this just voting on
No.
the extra one?
1 to 5.
Okay, well, can you take number 5 separately then, please?
Sure. Just give us a moment. So we'll vote on 1 to 4 first. And that has carried 100%. And now we'll vote on recommendation 5. That has carried 13 in favour and 1 against. Moving on to item 9, the draft trade waste bylaw approval for consultation. And we have got Julie and Peter back to speak to this. And we'll just note that there is an additional aspect to the Office of Recommendations which is on the screen, and I'm sure that Julie or Peter will speak to that.
Thank you. Thank you. This report can be taken as read. I'll get Peter to explain the additional amendment and also to note the typo that Councillor Butt has so efficiently identified in the previous item on page 129. Peter.
Thank you. So, the additional amendment there is a very minor matter, but we noted after this report was approved that the administration manual referred to guidelines for radioactive material as being the guidelines published by the National Radiation Laboratory. As of 2020, it's now the Code of Safe Practice for Unsealed Radioactive Material, published by the Ministry of Health. So the idea is here is that this would just be updated in the statement of proposal before it goes up for consultation. The bulk of the report refers to about 4 key areas of change. As Julie said, we'll take it as read, but just to highlight them very quickly, the introduction of a new category of trade waste called controlled trade waste. This is where trade waste dischargers who are discharging trade waste that is primarily domestic grade wastewater, but which has a high volume, would be put into their own category for controlled trade waste. There's a recommendation regarding permanent sink screens. This is not a mandatory requirement, but more of a discretionary one, allowing council officers to require this where there is a clear need for those sink screens to be installed. And then there's a minor change regarding tankard wastes, updating some of the references in that section to refer to the Trade and Industrial Waters Forum, and providing the opportunity for tankard waste collectors to hold either resource consent or a certificate of registration for offensive trade. And finally, we're having some changes there regarding providing clarity regarding penalty charges. While we currently do this on a case-by-case basis through the trade waste consents, we wanted to make it clear that that's how we would be approaching the imposition of penalty charges.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett, you've got a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Peter. The title of the bylaw has always intrigued me, especially when I first got here and was deeply confused because it only really seemed to deal with wastewater, but yet we stick with trade waste. I'm just wondering, is there a reason why we don't call it the trade wastewater bylaw?
I guess the answer to that one is primarily legacy. Within the sector, I think it's generally referred to as trade wastes, or trade waste. The Local Government Act, for instance, refers to trade waste as the phrase, for no greater reason than that, I suspect. I think within the sector, it's widely understood this is referring to wastewater discharge from a trade premises, but it's primarily just a legacy or convention.
Thanks for that clarification. Second question and final one was just on page 172, there is some strike through in the administration manual around the delegation of the authorization of changes. And just wondered with that strike through sort of where that delegation then sits to authorize changes in the administration manual.
It's really just a tidy up. When the bylaws were first developed with the administration manual back in 2015, the original intention was that many of the changes to the administration manual could be approved by an officer acting under delegated authority. And we had wording in the administration manual to make it clear that they would be authorised by the general manager. However, subsequent to that, we've now have a provision where amendments to the administration manual are approved by council by resolution. So taking out that wording is reflecting that there's no longer a requirement for them to be authorised by the General Manager.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Julie. The permanent sink screen, there has been some comments by members of the public about that, because they do feel that they do get people coming in, and through their licences they do get that basically, if I would say the word, tested by people coming in, and when they get their licences they get that sort of quite hardly tested. That part of the trade waste is, I mean, my question is around that being in the bylaw. Is that hard and fast?
So, yeah, good question. We went out to talk to trade waste consent holders, including food premises, before we started drafting this. And one of the ideas we wanted to engage with them on was this notion of a permanent sink screen to be fitted in food premises. The idea behind it was, while all these food premises have a grease interceptor, a grease trap, it doesn't prevent food entering the grease trap. And while the point of that is to stop that food waste from entering the wastewater system, it still can linger and cause an odour issue. And that's one of the things that council often has to grapple with, is how to respond to those odour complaints. The idea behind the permanent sink screen is that it captures a great quantity of food waste from entering into the grease trap at the start, so it reduces those odour issues and consequently reduces the odour complaints. What we did, though, in responding to some of the comments we received back from that feedback, was to tweak the approach slightly. So whereas before we had made this a mandatory requirement, we were proposing to make it a mandatory requirement, we're making it more of a discretionary one. So where there are complaints coming through, where there are obvious issues, and where the officer believes that a sink screen could alleviate those issues, then we have the ability to require it. But we're not making it a mandatory requirement for everybody. We also note that about 90% of premises already have these installed. They're coming as standard on modern sinks, so it's not an onerous obligation. And for those who do need to retrofit it, it's about a $25 cost per sink. So again, it's not a substantial cost increase where that is required, and it would only be required where there's a demonstrated need for it.
Thanks.
Just a reminder too, this is a proposed bylaw for consultation.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Not determined yet.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for the report. It says here you've done some consultation with the sector. Always, I mean, we have I suppose an industry that understands that we recover trade waste, but it's at cost. But it's always a bit of a challenge when you make some substantial changes. Have you spoken to various parts of the sector?
Yes, so everybody who currently holds a trade waste consent, they were contacted and given the opportunity to give some feedback. And that includes everybody who is a permitted trade waste discharger, so they don't hold a consent themselves. Provided they already comply with the bylaw, they're permitted to discharge. So we had a list of all of those, and they're primarily food premises, but we included all of those in our engagement. I think we got about 12 or 13 responses, which I think was representative of the fact that we weren't proposing significant changes here, and where we were proposing changes, there was generally good support for those. We also engaged a number of interest groups, so we included Environment Network Manawatu. I mentioned the Trade and Industrial Waters Forum, and a number of others whose names escape me. Ministry of Health, Ministry for the Environment. So I think we had a reasonably good broad engagement, given this was initial engagement, and we'll be engaging with them again formally when we go out for consultation.
Yeah, so you did the food, but what about laundries and others? Did we go to them as well?
Yes, anybody who has a trade waste consent was involved, yeah.
So how were they involved? Did you send them a letter?
They were given the same information that everybody was given. It was an email we put out. We gave them a breakdown of all the information the scope of changes we were considering, and asking them to provide feedback on that or any other matters.
And their general feedback?
It was generally positive, yep. One of the things we talked about was this change which we haven't taken forward, which is the switch from biochemical oxygen demand to chemical oxygen demand testing. There was general support for that, but there was some concern about what it might mean for charges. We did take that very seriously, and when we looked at how that charging regime might pan out, we found that it wouldn't meet the objectives we were trying to achieve. So that's why we haven't taken it forward, and I think that shows how we've responded to those concerns from the people who responded to us.
Good, thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a very quick question, Peter and Julie. Just around clause 33.1, which talks about the transitional arrangements. Just in terms of existing trade waste consents, are there any implications there in terms of sort of overlaps and expiry dates?
No, so the date we've set there is very deliberate. The way this will work, given when the bylaw is due to come into effect, which will be end of April, early May next year, any trade waste consent which is issued right at the end will be for a maximum of 2 years. So this allows for their existing consents to run their course before they get captured by the new system. Yeah.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for your report. From your explanation, I'm getting that some of the trade waste producers doesn't have a consent. So is there a threshold or limit where the consent becomes obligatory, or?
Yeah, so in the administration manual, there's 2 schedules. Schedule 1 has the permitted characteristics of trade waste. Any trade waste discharge which is within those limits is deemed permitted trade waste and can be discharged without a consent. If it exceeds those characteristics, then, and provided it doesn't have any of the prohibited characteristics which are in Schedule 2, then they can apply for a trade waste consent, and the consent is granted based on certain conditions or possibly some additional charges based on the extent to which it exceeds those permitted characteristics.
Thank you.
Mr Mayor, you've got another question.
No, not really. I just wanted to follow, well, it is. My colleague indicated there's a whole lot of people that have, with trade waste, are exceeding trace waste bylaws. That isn't the case, is it? Well, I'm not aware of it.
Sorry, I didn't catch that question you said.
So our councillor asked that there's a whole lot of trade waste customers that are exceeding their bylaws, the bylaw. Is that the case?
No. So,
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Julie. There's no further questions. I'm happy to move that the draft Palmerston North Trade Waste Bylaw 2022 consultation document as attached to the report titled Draft Trade Waste the report titled Trade Waste, Draft Trade Waste Bylaw Approval for Consultation, presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on the 11th of August 2021 as amended for consultation with the public. That the Mayor and Deputy Mayor be authorised to approve minor amendments to the consultation document prior to publication. Is there a seconder? Councillor Hancock. So, can we go back, because I'll need to read that other one out. So I'm just going to read out the second part for our friends online. So and this is the additional amendment from staff, section 1.3H of Appendix 2 of the Administration Manual to read radioactive material unless the material is discharged in accordance with the Code of Practice for Unsealed Radioactive Material published by the Ministry of Health. And that was explained by staff at the introduction of their report. Right, I'll open it up for any comments. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to acknowledge the staff. And I also just want to put it out there publicly that our team, certainly in the trade waste offices, have done an exceptional job to continue to just keep lifting the bar. So I just want to, there was a couple of comments that we have people that are on expired trade waste permits and everything. That's not the case. The city actually recovers 100% of those costs. That is not the case elsewhere around New Zealand. And I know, just want to acknowledge the trade waste people because they've done a very good job of getting industry in line and accepting that waste is part of doing their business rather than just pushing the button and the council worries about it. So this is just a continuation, not only of keeping that standard to a very high level as we come into nature calls. This sort of work is very, very important. Not all councils are as diligent at this level of work, so I just want to ensure that we know that we are doing the right thing. We have food industries here, we have laundries, we have medical and hospital waste, we have pharmaceuticals, but there are some sectors that probably wouldn't get a consent here just because of the very nature of what we do here. And I think in some ways that's probably good planning too, and there are other areas where those sorts of industries can go. But again, just commending the work that's going on, and if you're bringing the sector with you, which it seems we are, I think that's really, really good. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. There are no further elected members in the queue to speak, so I will invite you to vote. We'll vote on resolutions 1 to 3.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, what is the first recommendation we're voting on?
That's the one I just read out as amended by, it's the number 1 in your order papers, plus with the addition of that statement that needs to be changed in the administration manual.
Thank you.
And that has carried 100%. Moving on to item 10, mitigating East Street traffic safety concerns. This report is presented by Sandra King. Page 193.
Good morning, councillors. I thought I'd keep this very simple and take the report as read. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Just want to touch on a few key points in the report. We agree there is a need to mitigate traffic safety concerns on East Street. At the timing of developing the LTP, we had that in year 3 in terms of our low-cost, low-risk program. So I think I've explained that in the report and provided some options on what potentially we could do if councillors believe they wanted to look at bringing something forward. The issue is around timing and prioritisation against other interventions across the city. We have quite a rigorous process we go through, taking account of safety, speed, land use, schools. There's a whole range of things that need to be addressed across our city, and within the budgets that we have. I also want to highlight the current funding uncertainty we have. previous LTPs, we would have known at LTP time what our Waka Kotahi fund or co-fund would have been for all our programs. At this stage, we still have not heard, and we don't expect to hear till 1st of September, which is after the board meeting. So there has been signals of significant funding cuts, so we'll need to analyse our transport programs once we hear what's happening in that space. So I'll just open it up to any questions that councillors might have.
Thank you. First question from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Sandra. A couple of questions. If we were to go for option 1A with providing additional capital new funding of 100,000, does that mean that we would then forgo the 51% subsidy that we would have been getting from Waka Kotahi if it had gone ahead in year 3?
Yes, is the short answer, because we wouldn't be pushing out any other programs, so it'd be an additional thing to do above and beyond. Yeah.
Okay. And then my second question is around how we're funding some of the other programs that you've listed, and in particular the programs in Highbury. So I asked a lot of questions coming into the 10-year plan around the Highbury road safety situation. And what I was told is that the pedestrian crossings were being funded from the Village Streetscape programme 1803. But from reading this report, it looks like the pedestrian crossings are actually being funded from the minor safety 279. So can you clarify that?
Unfortunately, Chris isn't here, who helped develop that, so he's unfortunately at another appointment, so I don't have that intel directly right here, but I understand that some of those safety improvement works are under the low cost, low risk program, but there is some other work being developed in that streets area at the same time, so it's been dealt with under 2 programs.
Yes, and I think that's where I'm a bit confused. So having been told that the pedestrian crossings were covered under 1803, I now see that the pedestrian crossings are listed as being covered under 279 in point 2.6.1. So I'm just a bit concerned that if we were to decide to prioritise East Street over the existing prioritised safety improvements, that those pedestrian crossings in Highbury listed in 2.6.1 would be pushed out and are in fact not covered under 1803. Is that your understanding?
We might just see if the General Manager might be able to provide a little bit more clarification.
Well, I was just going to say we can go and get the feedback. Unfortunately, we don't have Chris here, so we don't have the detail with us. We can go and find that detail.
Okay.
My apologies. We've got a few people off sick at the moment, so we're sort of struggling a bit with people.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's fine. In the absence of any clarification, I'll just assume that what's in the report is correct and that the pedestrian crossings in Highbury that are listed would be at risk if we push this programme, if we prioritised East Street over the other programmes.
Can I just say we haven't done any analysis on what we would look to push out. So we recognise that Highbury is an important area of high risk, so that might help the councillor with that. We haven't done the analysis on what programs might be pushed. We've identified what the cluster of programs we have, but we haven't done the analysis of what we would have to shift around, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. I've just got one more question, if that's okay. So in terms of the temporary treatments, which is option 2 in the paper, those temporary treatments, my reading of the paper is that council staff think that they would provide useful information about the design and type of the permanent treatments. Is that correct?
That's correct. Temporary treatments do enable you to think about how you design something and how it works in practice. They would be temporary treatments that are of standard safety practice that we would be looking to put in.
Okay. But there is also a note that if we chose that option, that staff would be spending time doing that and that other projects might be delayed?
It's just additional workload to add to the program when you add another piece of work to do, so.
Okay. All right, I've got some comments, but thank you for your answers.
Just want to clarify from the first questioning that Councillor Johnson was going down. You've said that there's been no analysis done on what programs would essentially be pushed back or reprioritised, really. So, I mean, in that same vein, then there's no security to programs that may have been through a similar process here, where they were raised and prioritised, because we would essentially be bumping everything down. Is that correct?
Essentially, we've gone through quite a rigorous process to look at the whole city and look based on, you know, safety, land use, school clusters, shop clusters, traffic speeds across the city, and within the budgets, how do we prioritise that and where do we start first? So I think it's important to realise that if you decide to make a change, you want to elevate something, it's going to have an impact on other areas, and we'll need to go away and actually analyse what that would look like.
Okay.
At the moment, you approve a program, a budget program level, and we are tasked with determining how we target that in the right spaces.
And can I ask, what is the risk, if any, to the integrity of that process if we are responding directly to concerns raised through the council chamber and acting on those individually?
They are a snapshot in time, so I think it's important to realise that issues happen in a network as things change, so we have to be constantly reviewing, but we do a 3-year program and we're set and locked in that with Waka Kotahi, so there's an analysis there on the alignment and risk to the GPS, and that's kind of how the prioritisation works, taking account of what we know on the network. So things will come up and things will change, so we have to be mindful of that, but we have to be aware that we've already proven the case for other areas, so it's a bit of a balancing act.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Sandra. I've got a number of questions. The first one there is really just around sort of confirmation, I guess, of the vehicle movements in East Street and the speeds, I think, which are now 56.5 kilometres per hour on average. How does that compare with similar streets around Palmerston North?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. My colleague is not here to help me with the data that he would have in his head.
I've seen one piece of correspondence which suggests I think it's about 1,100 vehicles per day, I think. Is it? Can we confirm that? Yep. Thank you. So just in terms of the equipment, under option 2, the temporary equipment, that's rubberised, I guess mass-produced equipment that can be used to temporarily mitigate traffic issues. Can that be reused once it's installed?
I understand, well, if we're leaving it in for 2 years, we might get a bit of wear and tear, so we'd have to look at how it's performed over that time and whether we can reuse it or whether it's deteriorated to a point that it can't be reused. So we'd have to assess that at the time, after the time it's been laid.
Okay. So under option 2, we're perhaps anticipating that equipment might be in place for until year 3 before
Correct, yes.
Okay. So just in terms of the $24,000, and perhaps this is a question for the CFO, is that doable for council? Is that an option?
Short answer is anything's doable. It would be borrowed, basically extending on your borrowing.
I mean, just to clarify, when it's option 2 is provide additional funding, which is unbudgeted, to be really clear, isn't it?
Yeah, effectively what we're asking for is an additional budget of $24,000, which we will then borrow to fund.
Yes, thank you. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Sandra, for the report. quite a few of what the questions that were on my mind have been addressed. I guess one thing that I was trying to understand is sort of a bit more of the traffic survey that was done recently, in that the sort of concerns that were brought to us through that petition weren't sort of the average speeds, they were the outlier speeds, and especially speeds at night. And just did we pick up information on that in terms of the range of speed and whether any sort of excessive, like truly excessive speeds were documented?
We will have that information. I don't have that at hand to identify what the outliers were in terms of speed, but there will definitely be that information that's captured when I can find that information for you if you like. I have to come back to you.
Would a speed camera fix this?
Good question, possibly. At a cost, I'm not sure what the cost of speed cameras are to put in this area.
Do you know if it was like a considered option, like just everything that came through was sort of changes on the street rather than sort of enforcement type things? I'm just wondering.
Sarah?
It's just in the broad context of that, though, we haven't reported in this any major huge variances in speed for this road, which we might have picked up or we might not have because the time of the survey might not have picked it up. But I think that would relate to a lot of other streets in Palmerston North in the same way. So in terms of where would we put speed cameras, should we control them? Again, that would be a different question. They might resolve the issue here, but again, they might not be the first place that we'd put speed cameras if we wanted to bring down those really, really high speeds.
Great, thank you for that. And can I just ask, because again, the petitioner had concerns around sort of young children being woken and that sort of stuff. Was there any acoustic monitoring done, or was it only speed monitoring?
No acoustic monitoring that I'm aware of was undertaken. No.
Okay. Great. Thanks for clarifying those, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Sandra. There's no further questions. So looking now to the recommendations, I'm going to move recommendation 2, seconded by Councillor Johnson. And just a brief comment is that I agree that we need to respond to the concerns that have been raised by the person who's presented the petition on behalf of that neighbourhood, and there's evidence to say that action needs to be taken around here. However, I've got concerns about the risk of us putting a very clear process that we have to measure and prioritise all sorts of concerns across our city by reprioritising and moving this up the list. It has already been programmed for Year 3, and I think that that is the most appropriate place and timing as determined by a very thorough process that we are putting all sorts of requests through. We need to recognise that not all pieces of work that require attention do come through the council chamber. There is a lot of monitoring and proactive assessments that are pulling programs to go through this particular process around prioritisation. And whilst we have had a group of people in the community who have raised something, that can still go through that process as well. But I don't think that it should be bumped up the list because of bringing something through the council chamber. We have to be able to remove the political element out of decision making, particularly around road safety, and not compromise the integrity of a process that we've effectively endorsed by saying this is how we're going to prioritise and fund safety improvements around traffic movements in our city. Right, I'll just open up for other comments. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I think I will support this recommendation. I think number 1 was perhaps a step too far. And, you know, I think this is the best response, because we don't, I mean, the Highbury community, who actually have been writing to us, and I have a number of letters about what they require there. Their issues are just as important. Number two, the boy racer issue, which seems to move around the city, and at the moment is centred around Longburn. And the Chief Infrastructure Officer and I know the issues that we're facing there, and that's no disrespect to East Street, but it pales in insignificance to what's happening in some of these other places. I think we are responding though too. We've had a petition. They've been beating down Councillor Barrett's door. They've been beating on my door as well, and we are responding to them. Number two, and most importantly, it doesn't jeopardise our co-funding with Waka Kotahi NZTA. If we were to jump to number one, I think that would be somewhat foolish. And as we have challenges across the country, we would probably be the first to be struck off the list. So I think number two is the best option forward. We're responding to residents in the right way. We're not jeopardising the order of how things are to be done. Otherwise, we will just have everybody else in here saying their street or their project is the most important. So I think this is the correct and right response. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, I'm happy to support this because on the one hand, I feel great sympathy for the residents of East Street when you and your children have been woken up every night through excessive noise from speeding vehicles. The prospect of having to wait another 2 or 3 years to get a solution isn't a very attractive one. But then on the other hand, I'm really reluctant to prioritise East Street over other parts of the city where we know that there's a higher prioritisation. And I do think we need to be a little bit careful about which communities are able to organise themselves and come in and present a petition and which are not. And the comments from the Deputy Mayor around when we've got a system that we're using for prioritisation, then it probably is fairer to use that rather than just be responding to requests in a sort of an ad hoc manner. I think that's going to get us into trouble. So whilst I have sympathy for East Street, I'm not really wanting to prioritise their problem ahead of problems in other parts of the city, and specifically Highbury, where there are significant road safety issues for school children in particular. So there's that. The other advantage of number two is that it gives staff the learning of 2 years of the temporary safety treatments, and that may well mean that the final outcome is more effective. And so I think there's an advantage in going for number two in the sense that the temporary safety treatments will give us some useful information about how the final version might need to be tweaked, and so I think that in itself would be helpful. And then finally there's the issue of the funding. So I don't really want us to lose the 51% subsidy. So what that means is if we are doing this, if we chose to do this now, we'd be paying the full 100, well, ratepayers would be paying the full 100,000. If we do it in year 3, there's a chance we get the 51% subsidy. So all in all, I think the temporary solution is offering something to the East Street residents that will provide some relief in the short term. They're still scheduled for year 3, but it's also not deprioritising other areas of the city that have equally, if not more so, a need for road safety improvements. So I'm happy to support number 2.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's been good to hear from colleagues' perspectives on this to date. I've certainly, thought about this a bit, and I suppose the thing that I find most challenging about it is that it's diagnostic of the challenge that we actually face as a city, which is that we're chronically underinvested in the sorts of road safety and livable streets sort of space. And yes, this could be replicated in many other parts of the city and probably should be. The impatient side of me would have liked to see us jump to just sort it now, but I have heard the arguments around the value of a prototyping and seeing what works sort of approach, and concerns about process and precedent. I suppose some comments just in terms of what's happened sort of since the petition to now. Good to hear that, you know, some monitoring has been undertaken, but just making sure that we're deploying the sorts of monitoring that speaks to the nature of the petition, and in this case, you know, that sort of noise concern, and you know, how many loud mufflers we can stop with street furnitures and bumps and all that sort of stuff, I guess, has yet to be determined. So I'm a bit concerned that we still potentially have an ongoing problem there, given that the noise side of things is quite often just deliberate antisocial behavior, whether or not there's a safety aspect associated with it or not. But except that officers have brought us a workable temporary solution that will give us some insight, and that will, you know, sooner rather than later give us the livability dividend and give us the safety dividend that we're really after. So hopefully it will indeed deliver those benefits. And, you know, I think it's an area where we still need to reconsider from a whole of city point of view how we respond and how we invest in this space, because one of the key advantages we enjoy as a city is livability, accessibility. People value those things, and the sorts of behaviors that we currently see on our streets put that at risk. Madam Chair.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My only point I'd like to add, that I'm appalled that we're in August and that we still haven't got confirmation of the funding from Wakakatahi. And also that there's an indication that we might not get our funding. And this puts the pressure on the council staff and our projects. So we may have to come back and actually look at the prioritisation. And I mean, this is a health and safety issue, so I think we should, as a council, be banging on government's doors and Wakakatahi's door and say it's not good enough. So that's, but I will support, reluctantly I'll support this, but we certainly need to be more audible about our dissatisfaction with the funding.
Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Again, I'm would have liked to have supported option one. The residents came to me, and I'm the one that suggested to do the petition. I walk my dog down the street, see the cars go down the street, and it is very noisy. It is a shortcut street. I agree with Councillor Johnson, we could do many other streets across the city, but it is hard when you do see the evidence going down the street. It is a shortcut street to Massey. A lot of people do use it, so it is great to do something, and at least option two is something, and the residents will be pleased to see something done in the short term. So thanks for supporting it.
Right, I've got no further speakers in the queue. Just before we go to vote, I'll just highlight the delegation for this decision sits with council, and so I would ask that the questions that were unable to be answered, if they could be circulated before the full council meeting, just in case that impacts people's vote, and then we've got space if anything else needs to be done. Right, I can't remember, but I think I've read this one out. So, did I read this out? Okay, I did not read this out. Great. So, we're going to vote on the recommendation on the screen, which is that the council consider and determine the appropriate response from the following options for installation of permanent traffic safety treatments in East Street, and that was option 2, provide additional funding up to $24,000 to install temporary safety treatments in East Street in financial year 2021 to 2022, which is year 1, immediately, and proceed to install permanent safety treatments as planned in financial year 2023 to 2024, which is year 3. It's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Johnson. I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 14 in favour and 1 abstention. Moving on to item 11, which is our committee work schedule. Bit of read on this report. I'll hand that over to David to make comment on some of the proposed changes.
Yeah, the only couple I want to just draw your attention to is the change to item 1, the reporting date. So I've had a conversation with the CFO, and that is about resourcing. So there's a vacancy in the procurement space at the moment. The other one is new item 2, the community support policy. So just a slight delay there to make sure that all the internal checks and balances are done to that policy before it comes through to committee.
Thank you. And can I just ask about that item, the community support policy? So that was on the work schedule for community development, and my understanding was it was moved to planning largely because the timing of the report with a quarterly committee. Because that's delayed, would that be appropriate to send that back to community development?
I had a conversation with the Assistant Chief Executive on this. I understand there has been a conversation that it's related more to the terms of reference, and it's more appropriate that, given the terms of reference of the Planning and Strategy Committee, it's more appropriate that it goes to that committee.
Okay. We do have some questions on the work schedule. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So following on from the comments of the General Manager, can I just have a more detailed explanation about what it is around the terms of reference of the Community Support Policy that means that it wouldn't go to the Community Development Committee, which would seem to me to be the logical place for it to go?
Well, the policy deals with more than community matters. So it's a policy issue, not a community funding issue.
But it's about community funding, isn't it? How has it been broadened out to be wider than community? I don't understand.
So if I can respond through the chair. So the policy now is a result of the audit that came to council now and is broadened out and encompasses economic events. It also encompasses sponsorship, etc. So it's taken a broader approach than just that's was previously the community funding policy. Also incorporates the funding that's around the natural and cultural incentive funding, which is about strengthening earthquake-prone buildings and providing funding for heritage buildings. So it has a much broader application than just community group support.
Okay. Councillor Johnson, did you have any further questions?
No, I'll have a comment there, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I wonder if I could seek a comment on item 8, on the movement of dates from June to December.
That's more to do with the scale of the project. So we're in the early project planning phases. As you'll be aware, it is a very significant project, so we've been rephasing the timing of that project, so we think it's going to require that amount of time to be complete. That will still allow the project to inform the next LTP, which I think is the key driver for that piece of work.
Can I just also seek clarification that the funding for that project is in this financial year, not next?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also on item 8, I just wanted to inquire around the deferring to December when there's issues around the earthquake strengthening with Te Manawa and also the library, and pushing it out again seems to impact our optionality and choices later on this report.
Yeah, I mean, we have 15 years to address, well, it might be 14 years now, to address the library issue. So we're talking, a 6-month delay to a 14-year decision-making timeframe.
And a follow-on question, just with the report specifically, I understood that originally this subject was to report back on the budgets and timelines, indicative at least, which we've never had, to actually approve the scale and scope of the project as a whole. And it seems like you've mentioned that it's getting big, but I just don't know if the council's approved how big this project is maybe becoming. I just want to understand what is the intention of the subject line there? Is it broader than just the timeline and budget?
So the resolution was further consultation, timelines, costs, but also including the library. So we have an existing draft master plan, which is the basis of this work. But as you'll be aware, that piece of work was completed before we identified that the library was earthquake prone. So when you include the library, we do have the draft master plan as the basis, but once you add the library to that piece of work, you're starting to ask questions about whether or not the library in Te Manawa should be one facility, separate facilities. That is a large question for the community and the council to work through, along with the costs and timeframes and funding of a project of this scale. So.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Again on item 2, Councillor Johnson did ask the question, but I still have a problem now. If it was originally with the community committee, what has changed that makes it come to this committee?
I think
initially it was community, and now suddenly it becomes planning. What's changed in the report?
So the answer that the General Manager gave around outlining that was the scope. So when you say what has changed, it is the scope that has changed.
Not what was said. It said we were given things that were reasons why it should come here, but nothing was said what has changed in the report. I listened very carefully to both the General Manager and what they both said, and I couldn't hear any changes, just their opinions. And I just still want to like to know why has it come from community.
Perhaps the Assistant Chief Executive could reiterate what has changed.
So what has changed is the breadth and scope of the policy, which now touches on funding that straddles economic, in addition to community, as well as the planning aspects of earthquake-prone and natural and cultural and heritage funding, which is under the terms of reference for the Planning Committee. So it straddles several committees' responsibilities, which brings it to a policy matter.
Then can I ask why they were put in there since it was being moved here? Why were those 3 things put into this report?
When the piece of work started, my understanding is that's when the scope broadened. It was an opportunity to include other things in the review, then rather than a more originally narrow focus. I imagine that otherwise it would have required a separate piece of work that would have been almost identical.
I'll be very interested to see the report when it comes through.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is also related to item 8. And I recognise Councillor Dennison has asked some questions around that already. The direction of that came in April 2019, which was the previous term of council, and the proposed date is actually proposing that it comes back to the next council. So this actually spans three separate councils from the direction to the first report. And so I guess where my concern is, and I'd like perhaps to have some questions answered, is around the intent and the instructions for this piece of work, and particularly in relation to the direction around the consultation that was asked for, and when the timing of that consultation would be proposed to be. And also, in terms of the scope of that project, you've talked about it being a significant project and the scale of the project. It would be good to know that in the context of where the consultation sits, because my expectation would have been that there may have been consultation prior to any sort of significant project.
So there's a little bit in there. I guess the first thing I'd just like to clarify, I guess, is regardless of the previous work completed on the master plan or this resolution or the budget, the council has an earthquake-prone library, an earthquake-prone museum, components of this building which are earthquake prone, which are going to require to be addressed. They are significant projects with a significant investment. So part of this process is about saying we need a plan about the way in which we're going to deliver that scale of investment. I think there's $60 million alone for earthquake strengthening in the LTP at the moment, with little direction about how that is delivered. So questions about the future of the library and the Te Manawa need to be answered, for instance, before you can start to spend that scale of money. So I think this piece of work is about building on that previous piece of work. There will be, during the process for this piece of work, there will be direct engagement with key stakeholders and the community. We're yet to determine whether there would then be a formal consultation process as part of this plan. However, the master plan and the outputs of that would come back to council for consideration, and ultimately the key consultation process to come for this project is likely to be the next LTP, because the reality is you've got, as we said, we've got $60 million plus to spend on these facilities with no plan at the moment. So the idea is between now and the next LTP, we do this piece of work, we understand what we need to achieve, we engage with the community. Consultation, as you'll know, can occur through a variety of forums. It can be as part of the LTP, it can be separate. We've seen that with nature calls and other big projects. So I anticipate that this project would be no different.
Can I just, for further clarification then, are you suggesting that there is consultation that will occur prior to this report coming to us?
There would be engagement. There'll be council workshops where we can tease through whether the council is keen for a public consultation exercise before the LTP. However, I think engagement is different to consultation. So the idea is that there would be engagement with stakeholders, there'd be council workshops, and there would be an opportunity for the council to have a conversation with officers about whether there is any formal consultation on this project prior to the next LTP, or whether engagement is sufficient in the lead up to the next LTP.
Sorry, just one further question then. How does that deliver on the instruction in March of 2019 to consult the community?
Well, to consult the community, you need a plan. We don't have a plan at the moment.
So what's informing the plan that this piece of work is asking the consultants to draw?
So there will be council workshops, there will be engagement with the stakeholders. Until such time as there is a plan, you cannot consult.
I think it's because it's a complicated process. To simplify, if we look at the trade waste bylaw that we've just signed off for consultation, there was engagement with the sector beforehand, which informed the bylaw, which then came to us to sign off to consult. So that was what we were consulting on, and there was early engagement that fed into that process. I mean, it's a different process, but I see it as very similar by way of seeking views to inform a plan, a draft plan, in which is then that is what is consulted on.
Can I ask one further question then? Because I do understand we had a draft master planned for the civic and cultural precinct that did cost the ratepayers a significant amount of money to develop. And I had presumed that that would be a part of what was used for the consultation process that we gave direction for in April 2019, rather than having to pay for a completely new plan that actually hasn't got any direction from our community in terms of scope.
So that initial plan will be used as the basis for developing call it a version 2 or generation 2. As I said earlier, that initial plan did not in any way, shape or form address the library.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, just another question about item 2. So the community support policy, although it should probably be called something else now since it seems to encompass so much more, that was work to be done during the 10-year plan, and it was actually mentioned in the 10-year plan, but it wasn't ready for the 10-year plan consultation. Given that it's now been pushed back to September, how is that going to impact applications for the next round of the strategic priority grants, which are occurring in October?
So it won't be able to influence those. However, if there is a decision through this process to, I guess, provide some dedicated funds, I forget the exact wording for it, then that would just need to be through the development of the policy. If we decide that we want to provide dedicated funds to some community groups, then in the next financial year we'd need to make some budget adjustments to the fund and make those dedicated to those groups if they receive funding outside of that strategic priority grant.
So effectively it delays any decision making around that for a year?
Yes.
Any further questions? Great. I'll move that the committee resolve that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated August 2021. Seconded by Councillor Bowen.
Or that I was trying to join the queue to...
Oh, you can use your device to join the queue.
Oh, yes, it's there. Thank you. But happy to second that if...
Thank you. And I'll open up for comments. Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No surprise on item 2. If this support policy is going to be reported to the Planning Committee, I really think the word community should be changed. Over the years I've been on council, I have seen so many things taken away from community, changed slightly and said it would have to be going to another committee. The Community Committee once was the biggest committee in this council, is now one of the smaller ones, because the workload that was on that committee has now been taken away and put into other committees. And this is just another case of the same thing happening. I actually feel that this support policy should be going back to the Community Wellbeing Committee, and that's where it belongs, because as long as you have the name community, it should be in the Community Committee. So if this is going to stay here, the name Community Support Policy should be changed to something else.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move an amendment to the work schedule that item 8 is delivered in June 2022 and not December. My reasoning behind that, and grateful to the General Manager, Chief Planning Officer, for those comments, is that this piece of work is programmed for this financial year. June will be the last time in this financial year it can be reported because of council recess. And I accept that that work is outsourced and there might be issues, but if that work can't be fully reported in June, I think it's appropriate that this term of council receives at least an interim report before we move into the next triennium. As the Chief Planning Officer said, the driving issue in this piece of work is the earthquake-prone buildings issue, and the clock is ticking. It's 2 years this month since we put our label on the library building to say that that was earthquake-prone. So we're down to 13 years already. It will be 12 years when that report comes back to us. If we're serious about keeping as many options on the table as possible and looking not just to the council's $60 million, because that will not do this piece of work, but to looking at external opportunities for funding, then we have to move in this space because every other council is also facing the same time frames. So I accept that this is challenging in terms of our internal pressures, and accept that the report that I'm asking for in June might not be full and final, but I think it's important that we get it through in this triennium. So I'll move that is retained as June and seek a seconder.
Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Harpiter? Right, we are speaking just to the amendment at the moment, and we are going to vote on that first. So I've got a number of people in the queue. If you would like to speak to the amendment, could you give me a wave? Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I support the amendment, but probably for some similar and some slightly different reasons than have been outlined already. I'm actually quite concerned that the original direction that Council gave to this piece of work, that the intent has been moved away from. I recognise that there is a need to address some issues around the library in Te Manawa, but the piece of work at the time the overall draft master plan wasn't approved by this council because there wasn't enough detail around costings and timeline, and we hadn't consulted the community on it. So whilst there was some support for it, council at the time felt that we should actually talk to our community before endorsing a significant plan as had been outlined. There was no consideration during those, that I can recall, during that discussion to embark on a new piece of work prior to having that consultation with our community. And I'm really concerned about the scope creep that has come into this piece of work, the budget creep or expansion of budget significantly, before we've had a chance to really seek from our community their thoughts or their feelings about this piece of work. I've talked before about a baked cake, and I'm really concerned that if we pay $150,000 to a consultant to provide a new plan before we've gone to our community and asked them, then that I'm extremely uncomfortable with that in terms of a process going forward. I think 3.5 years is far too long, especially when it spans 3 separate councils. So there's already people around this table that haven't been a part of that conversation that we had back in March of 2019. In December of 2022, there will most definitely be new people around this table who won't have heard the conversations in this term or the last term, and then we'll be actually trying to make decisions on yet another new report that's been provided at the ratepayers' cost to us before we've even consulted the community. So whilst I support it coming back in June, I would also support further engagement with council to get the direction right about what the scope and the direction of this work looks like. Yes, we've bundled it with Te Manawa and the library, I recognise that, but I'm really concerned about us not talking to our community about this prior to getting another elaborate report, which I think could be seen as a baked cake. I think we need to engage, and that needs to be in terms of options and ideas, not a fixed plan. So I'm really uncomfortable with where this is going, and I'll certainly support bringing it earlier, but would support further engagement prior to June 2020 as well to make sure that we're on the right track with this.
Thank you. I'm a little bit backwards with my process, and I apologise for that, but I would like a comment from staff around changing the date and the impact on that.
Yeah, so if the date is changed to June, it's likely to be an update report rather than a final master plan. However, I would expect that whatever's presented in June is being discussed with councillors through workshops between now and then. So there wouldn't be a surprise in June, and there'd be engagement with stakeholders. And I guess just to clarify one other thing, the 2019 resolution said costs, consultation and timelines, including library options. I want to make it very clear that the current master plan will be used as the basis for developing this piece of work, and the current master plan does not include any option whatsoever for the library. So if you were to consult the community with a plan, you need to include a plan which includes the library and the relationship with Te Manawa. So for officers to give effect to the resolution, we need to do more work. We cannot consult on a plan with costs and timeline that do not include the most significant part of the project.
Thank you, Dave. So just to clarify that even if this passes, it's likely to just be an update report, and the full report would still come as per the current timeframe?
So June would be, as I said, June would be an update report based on the current timeframe that we're working with. You know, I mean, we can do our best to get it earlier than December, but at this stage, given the scale of work, that's what we're suggesting when it would be finalised.
Are you still wishing to continue with your amendment as listed, or would you want to amend it to be an update report in June with a final report?
I'm happy with the amendment as stated. I absolutely hear the Chief Planning Officer's comments. I'm sure officers will do their best to provide as much information as possible to the timeframe that the Council is setting out. I will just note at this stage that we're in this situation because elected members asked for consultation 2 years ago. That wasn't the office's recommendation 2 years ago, it's what we asked for. So I'm pushing this process along, but I feel it's a little unfair to blame officers for where we are today when we asked for it.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, accepting of an update report in June. I think that would be fair, but maybe there becomes a 8-9 in the work schedule where there's an update report and maybe the final report in December. But I think we should have some expectation that we want to have input in before we get a final plan, because otherwise I see the risk that Councillor Naylor's outlined, that it becomes a baked cake and we've got very little optionality when we come to the long-term plan draft. And so I'd rather have some input in sooner than December. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to be clear, the amendment is changing the timeline of the report. There is no update report currently in the work schedule, and it is not, the amendment is not calling for an update, it is calling for the change of timeline of the report. The update is actually just what officers have indicated, that even with the amendment, that is likely the scenario. Speaking to the amendment, Councillor Johnson.
I'm going to support the amendment because I really think that we need to be a bit firmer on the constantly slipping delivery timelines that we've got here. We've just heard that the delivery of the community support policy will now mean that any decisions we made in the long-term plan around potentially changing the way we fund organisations are going to be delayed by a year. And here we've got a report that's been on the schedule since April 2019 that staff are now telling us they won't be able to bring back by June 2022. I mean, everybody understands that sometimes resources are tight, but if a report can't be delivered in 3 years, I think we've really got to question the delivery capability of council.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak to the amendment? Right, we will put the amendment. That has carried 14 in favour with 1 against. So we're now moving back to the substantive motion, which is to receive the work schedule. And if you're wanting to speak to this, please jump in the queue. Councillor Johnson.
So I'm going to speak to item 2, which is the community support policy. And I mean, I'm finding this a very frustrating process. It feels to me as though the goalposts have been moved around this report multiple times. Originally, it was to come as a piece of work to be consulted on in the 10-year plan, and it was in fact referred to in the 10-year plan. Then we were told, oh no, it won't be ready in time. We agreed for it to go to planning in August to primarily because of timeliness, because the thinking at that point was if we could get it out in time for the SPG round in October, that we would be able to implement any changes to it that we might want to make and implement them in time for the next SPG round. Now we're hearing that no, it won't be able to have any effect on the SPG round now. And what that means is the SPG round is in October, but we're talking about funding for those organisations from July 2022, which means that if we don't get this report back in time to affect that SPG decision rounds, we lose another year, which means it's going to be July 2023 before any change is made to those organisations' funding that they've brought submissions to tell us how important it is 2 years previously. And I'm really concerned about the slippage in reporting and the impact that's having further down the piece. Then there's the whole thing about the enlarging scope and which committee it goes to. And I agree with Councillor Finlay. If the scope has increased so hugely that it now encompasses almost every aspect of funding that we supply, well then yes, we need to be changing the name. But behind all this is a group of really hard-working community organisations that have asked us for some changes in the way we fund things. And we're now saying, well, yeah, sure, we'll consider it. We might get around to it in 2 years' time. I'm just really unhappy.
Councillor Denison. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to echo some of the comments by Councillor Johnson. I find it really frustrating to be a first-term councillor in this space and be essentially passing on reports from before my time to potentially after my time. That doesn't really sit very well with me. And seeing reports that the original point of instruction is around 2019 and having it take so long is a concern. And one of the things I would quite like to see actually is if we do decide to move things from one committee to another committee, is still having that date of instruction in the work schedule, so we can actually keep an eye on those as well, because we've got in here the community support policy, but I don't see the date at which that originally appeared there as well, and I feel like if we keep doing that, things will keep slipping. So I just want to say we do need to keep an eye on it, and I accepted it when we had a 1.9% rates increase. I accepted that resources would be difficult, but now that we've got a much higher rates increase, I feel like, you know, I'm finding it a bit harder to accept.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, speaking to the concerns about item 2, I would hope that, having heard this conversations, when that report comes back in September, officers would give clear direction to how the impact on SPG will be handled. I'll note, Councillor Johnson mentioned the organisations that engage with us in good faith through our long-term plan process, and I think in turn, we as elected members engaged with the process in good faith. We had many discussions about the best way to handle the requests that were coming to us, and we felt genuinely that this piece of work was that. Knowing what we know now, we would maybe have taken a different approach and moved sums of money as separate budget lines, which we've generally not taken that approach as council because we've wanted to depoliticise the process. What happens when reports get pushed out and out is that we will use the powers that we have. So I don't want us to be in that situation, but I will note also that Creative Sounds have raised these issues every single long-term plan that I've been on this council, which is now 9 years of raising the issue. So I do hope that the report, when it comes, will specifically address this issue.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments to exercise my right of reply. I think we need to be mindful of the fact that we have a weekly update that comes from the Chief Executive that almost continuously explains the pressures on the organisation and the continuing pressures on the organisation. Just because we have addressed some of the pressures through our long-term plan budget, we are 6 weeks into the new year. We're not going to see progress immediately. In actual fact, we're only 6 weeks into a new budget, and so we probably wouldn't expect to see any changes for a number of months by the time recruitment, training, those sorts of things are addressed. So pressures on work schedules, delays in reports are all due to a minimal rate increase that was applied last year. The effects are going to be felt for some time. We can't assume it's going to be addressed immediately. We, in one sense, continually raise the pressures on staff and acknowledge that there needs to be some compassion, and then in other senses we completely ignore it and criticise the delays. I think we can't have it both ways. We have to acknowledge that some of these delays are self-inflicted because of decisions that we made a year ago. We're not going to see change immediately. I absolutely hear the concerns around items on the work schedule moving around. I think that we have got improvements that we can make, particularly around how that is communicated. Councillor Dingwall's highlighted a gap around the date of origin not transferring over, and that seems to be a very easy fix, where we'll just make sure that that happens with work schedules. I think that's a really important point. And likewise, ensuring that the current position is also got clear rationale with any changes. I also understand that all work schedules are now coming to the ELT collectively, whereas previously they only sat with individual general managers, and so there is going to be a different level of oversight across work schedules as a whole. So I would like to think that we would see some improvements, but I do think that some of the criticisms around timing are unfair. So with that, I'm going to invite you to vote on this item. That has carried 13 in favour and 2 against. So with that, that concludes our business today. Nō reira, na mihi nui kia koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Madam Chair, I'm now ducking off for some council business, so I'll leave the workshop in your hands, and I'll leave you to set that time frame.
Thank you. So we will break for lunch now, and we will recommence at 1 o'clock in the Missoula room for our workshop.